Voter suppression is alive and well, and our new research shows that it continues to harm communities of color across the United States. At first, people of color weren't allowed to vote at all. Then they faced threats of violence at the polls. Poll taxes, nearly impossible tests, and other barriers kept them from voting. Polling sites were moved to make voting as inconvenient as possible. Gerrymandering made their votes meaningless. We call the difference in voting rates between white people and people of color the racial turnout gap. In 1965, Congress came up with a solution: the Voting Rights Act. It required states and counties with a history of racial discrimination in elections to ask the federal government's permission before changing their voting rules. The Voting Rights Act worked. Over 4 decades, the racial turnout gap shrank. But remember those places with a history of racial discrimination? One of them, Shelby County, Alabama, sued the federal government after the 2008 election to escape the restrictions of the Voting Rights Act. They said that since there was no longer a racial turnout gap between black and white voters in their county, they shouldn't have to ask for permission to change their voting rules anymore. And in a 2013 case called Shelby County versus Holder, 5 Supreme Court justices agreed. They threw out this legal protection, and not just in Shelby County, Alabama, but across the whole country. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said upending the Voting Rights Act when it was working was like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. She was right, but the majority of the courts still got their way. Within hours, states began implementing laws making it harder for many Americans to vote. No surprise, they targeted people of color. And once again, the racial turnout gap grew, and it's still growing. In the last election, the racial turnout gap accounted for 14 million missing votes by people of color. Lots of things could be responsible for these missing votes over the past decade, but we know that the voter suppression unleashed by the Supreme Court is partially to blame. We know this because in places previously covered by the Voting Rights Act, the racial turnout gap has grown almost twice as fast as in the rest of the country. Voter suppression isn't a 19th century problem or a 20th century problem. It's happening right now, and we can measure it. Congress has the power to act against voter suppression and provide equal access to the ballot. You should demand it today.